Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aisha, and thank you so much for joining us for the online Minerals to Metals Forum hosted by the Southern African Institute for Mining and Metallurgy. Again, my name is Aisha. So today's topic for discussion is mine waste and closure, waste as a resource. We will explore the complex nature of waste in the mining sector, whether it be tailings or abandoned mine land. The panelists will discuss a socio-legal perspective on property and the governance of waste in the mining sector. First, we have Richard Kramer, a postdoctoral fellow at the Mineral Law in Africa chair. He will consider waste in the context of the law of property, with a focus on how the law regulates the way one may terminate ownership in property. Second, we will have Bernard Kengi, presenting on the importance of good governance in the management of mine wastes in order to promote the remediation of land and water in the post-mining context. Last, we have joining us from ENS Africa, Dalit Anstey, who will consider financial provision regulations and opportunities for sustainable finance initiatives in rehabilitation strategies. She will also consider what sustainability might look like in practice for community empowerment, post-mining, and some of the challenges faced by the sector. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us, and I will now hand over to Richard Kramer to get us started.
So today I will be discussing waste as property and the hard choices in respect of mine waste. So, as an introduction, in the law of property, a must have value. However, such value does not necessarily need negative. And the law accords different consequences to property depending on its value. The manner in which one may dispose of property may depend on its value. For example, plastic and glass with latent value in being recycled compared with soiled food containers which must be collected by So there are different forms of value which can attach to property. The two most obvious forms would be economic value and sentimental value. It is possible for property to have both a positive economic value and a positive sentimental value. It is also possible for property to have a positive economic value and a negative sentimental value, and vice versa. Finally, property can have both a negative economic value and a negative sentimental value. Expensive jewelry received as a gift from a partner serves as an example of property which has both a positive economic value and a positive sentimental value. But such jewelry, in the event the relationship sours, can then take on a negative sentimental value while retaining its positive economic value. A family heirloom of no particular economic value could have a negative economic value in that it takes up space, while retaining a strong sentimental value to the owner, who would perhaps dispose of it but for the attachment to the item. Finally, soiled food wrapping would constitute property with both a negative economic value and a negative sentimental value. In the law of property, we talk of abandonment, but it's necessary to distinguish between the use of the term abandon in the colloquial sense and the use of the term abandon in the legal sense. In the colloquial sense, one may refer to a neglected piece of property as abandoned. However, this does not mean it is abandoned in the legal sense. The question must be asked whether the law recognizes the relationship between the thing and the owner as validly terminated. It is usually considered uncontroversial in property law that all that is required to abandon a thing is to physically dispose of it with the intention of no longer being owner thereof. But in the prevailing legal framework, it is difficult to see how this can be achieved. How can one simply unilaterally dispose of a piece of property without violating laws regulating littering or dumping? Regardless of the value attached to property, the law regulates the manner in which it can be disposed of. There is no unrestricted right to abandon property as one sees fit. Such an unrestricted right is not viable, given the negative societal and environmental consequences that would result. It is necessary that the law strictly regulate the disposal of property. This brings us to the concept of waste. The general starting point would be the National Environmental Management Waste Act, which defines waste as any substance, material, or object that is unwanted, rejected, abandoned, discarded, or disposed of, or that is intended or required to be discarded or disposed of by the holder of that substance, material, or object, whether or not such substance, material, or object can be reused, recycled, or recovered. This definition is clearly wide enough to include an otherwise functioning laptop discarded in favor of a new model, as it is to include a used pizza box. The consequence of a thing falling within the category of waste is that it needs to be disposed of following the correct procedures as set out by law. It cannot simply be abandoned at will, but must be directed to the correct waste management stream. This may be more onerous depending on the nature of the property. The otherwise functioning laptop, if the owner cannot find a buyer, as potentially hazardous e-waste, would be more difficult to dispose of than the used pizza box, which can simply be put in a bin for collection by municipal waste services. This brings us to the concept of negative value. Property accrues a negative value not solely from being economically worthless. There must be something more to negative value than that. It cannot simply be taxes related to the ownership of property either, since taxes could potentially be negligible or even calculated at zero due to the low value of the property in question. There must be a burden that accompanies the property, such as a duty to maintain, which results in the property accruing a negative value. A duty to maintain is the most likely cause of immovable property, this being land, accruing a negative value. But in some cases, movables, and by movable I mean anything which does not permanently attach to land, such as your pen, the negative value would likely stem from the fact that that property has to be stored, and thus takes up space. This does not only apply to what we would traditionally consider as waste, such as food packaging which ends up on a landfill. This year saw the price of an otherwise valuable commodity such as oil accrue a negative value, primarily due to the cost of storing it, while buyers dried up due to lockdowns and the sudden decline in air travel. However, when concerned with the economic value of waste, it is important to keep in mind shifts in technology, as what was previously considered waste, in that it had a pure negative value, can accrue a positive value when value can be won therefrom. For example, new methods of recycling can assist us in winning valuable minerals which would otherwise lie unused from e-waste. How does mining waste fit into this? The value of mine waste is incredibly context sensitive. Obviously, sentimental value is completely irrelevant in this context. There's no question of emotional investment in a mine dump. But as technology advances, it may become possible to extract value from what was otherwise previously considered pure waste with no value. It is possible, for example, to extract bauxite from aluminium tailings. Further, the minerals used to produce thin film photovoltaic cells, which are used in solar panels, are often the byproducts of other primarily mined minerals such as aluminium, coal, copper, and zinc. The primary form which solid waste produced by mining takes is the mine dump. The legal status of dumps in the law of property is a strange one. Mine dumps can be considered movable property so long as the subjective intention of the creator of the dump was that it should not accede to the land. The same category of property as the computer through which you are listening to this discussion. The classification of mine dumps as movables is despite the fact that they often resemble small copies or hills on the land they occupy. It may be in the interests of a mine company to protect its stake in a mine dump from which minerals can be won in the future. However, in the case of a mine dump for which future use is not foreseeable, there would be no incentive to look after the waste. Mine dumps, given the manner in which they occupy land, as well as the environmental and societal impact resulting from their occupation of space, will straddle the duty to maintain associated with immovable property and the duty to store associated with movable property. Okay. The law will not permit the owner of a mine dump to simply walk away from the obligations to rehabilitate and maintain the land on which the dump is located. Abandonment in the common law legal sense means the unilateral termination of ownership by the owner without the cooperation of a third party. But it is not open to the owner of mine waste or a mine itself to simply terminate her relationship with her property by raising the common law doctrine of abandonment. However, one problem with mine wastes, such as dumps, as well as the actual mining sites themselves, is that they may not simply be abandoned. They may in fact be orphaned, given that the mining company that owns them can easily cease to exist. This is a part of a wider problem identified by academics such as Tracy Field Humby, who has criticized the manner in which mining rights can be passed from larger concerns to smaller concerns until the least equipped and most financially precarious company comes to hold the right in question, as well as the obligations to maintain and rehabilitate the land. Mine waste is thus a form of highly negative value property for which it is often difficult to pin down a responsible party. For example, a couple of years ago, it was estimated it would cost roughly 12 billion rand to treat the polluted water stemming from the Witwatersrand Basin alone. attempts to balance paying these costs between mining companies and the public satisfied nobody. When it was suggested that mining companies foot 2/3 of the bill, the specter of these companies simply declaring bankruptcy was raised, which itself would lead to proliferation of orphaned mines. A good legislative framework would hold producers of mine waste responsible. But in order to hold such producers responsible, they must exist. Otherwise, it is necessary for producers to be pursued into their metaphorical graves, or perhaps do better to hold mining companies which sell mining rights to smaller concerns to account. Financial security for mining is required in terms of the National Environmental Management Act and can even be increased on an annual basis. The problem, however, is how do we even begin to estimate the true costs of rehabilitation decades down the line? Is it feasible to expect a company to put up the true cost of rehabilitation as security before proceeding with mining operations? This runs the risk of seeing investment dry up and development slow down, with the consequence that the transformative goals of the legal framework created by the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act will be jeopardized. Sadly, there are no easy choices in this respect, but we can look towards other ways in which conceiving of waste as property can help us find the sweet spot between meeting society's needs and protecting the environment. One option is urban mining, through ensuring the latent economic value of property such as e-waste is tapped into by directing such objects to the correct management streams. In doing so, we can reduce our reliance on primary extractive methods such as mining and the environmental costs associated with the practice. While it is not possible to expand further on this topic in light of the scope of today's talk, the issue is one at the forefront of the Millia Chair's research going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for placing quite a highbrow principle of value and the duty of care into a very tangible context for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Isha. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to good afternoon to our co-panelists and participants. Can I carry on?
Sure, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is something that ensued from while I was busy with my PhD thesis. So my thesis focused on the life of mining, the active phase of mining. That's from prospecting to closure. And while I was concluding my thesis, I realized that there's supposed to be life after mining, and there's this huge amounts of waste that is created. And when you look across South Africa all the way up to DRC, you notice there's a lot of mine dumps, as Richard has just mentioned. There's a lot of those, and you wonder, why is this the case? And so I and Professor Mustard, being part of the CLP that you know of, Asia, came up with this idea of looking into how good governance can serve as a tool to remediate land and water. Of course, I know there's also air pollution as a result of mine waste, but we opted to focus on water and land for now. And so it did, and at the moment it's still a project, ongoing project. But what I'm going to share with you is possibly mostly what motivated us to take on this project. So The thing is, governance, good governance especially, is a process that can truly influence how leadership or management of certain things can go, including mine waste. And as Richard mentioned earlier, that it requires huge amounts of money to manage mine waste or to clean the waters of South Africa. And we know land access to land is always an issue in South Africa. In terms of water, South Africa is water scarce. And so this is one of the things that motivated this particular project. And if we want to achieve those things, I truly believe that there's need for good direction, good stewardship of who takes care of what and how is this achieved. So even if, I think Richard mentioned that it was calculated that about 12 billion rand was needed to rehabilitate some mines or some mine waste. And I can honestly tell you that even if you make that money available, without good leadership, which I believe principles of good governance can guide good leadership, without good leadership, that money is still not going to make the land usable or make the water, transform the waters in a condition that people can truly use it. So good governance with its processes as a process can really guide how lead systems to operate, of course, according to preferred practices, which in the case of South Africa, we know there's legislation which guide us on how to do certain things. And of course, there's also case law. And the private sector, there are all sorts of policies and things that can guide them to do that, into achieving that target. I'm going to focus on three main principles of good governance, whether good governance simply or good environmental governance. And I'm not saying these are the only three, there are a lot of them, but they're somehow connected. And I think if a system, be it government or corporate, or the private sector or the mining companies, if they can achieve or follow these three principles or features of good governance, the rest can fall into places. And I'm talking about accountability, participation, and transparency. You will notice that they're somehow very related, and in terms of environmental governance, all of them come up to always boil into one pot. And so to start with accountability, the thing is this: if we want to see, if we are to see the huge amount of mine waste that we see across South Africa disappear, or at least manage in a way that the land that exists is brought back to a state where it can be used for another purpose, or treat a water source to a point where people can use it again, we need some accountability from decision makers, those who are tasked with the responsibility to manage natural resources on behalf of the people. In the context of South Africa, of course, we're talking of government as the custodian of these resources on behalf of the people. So our decision makers in the form of government representatives acting on behalf of the people, they have to be accountable to say, we are making sure that this land is remediated to a point where some form of farming or some form of activities like sustainable development, which Michael Solomon once mentioned on this platform, where he strongly, and I agree with him, he strongly believes that after mining, there can be sustainable development if law can operate that. And we can achieve that if our leadership can adhere can be accountable enough to drive the project. Of course, on the condition that the money is there. Or on the other side, the corporate sector, the mining companies who after all have the responsibility to make sure that upon closure of their operations, they have to make sure that this land is returned to what as close as possible to what it was before, to a stage where at least other activities can happen on this land. And when I talk of sustainable development, I'm just talking about what can the land be used for. Can it, very often, it's not very likely that the land can be used for farming, at least not immediately, but there are other things that can happen, like attraction sites and solar farms and stuff. So those are things that can happen, but I say we need accountable leadership in this area where people have to be responsible enough to say, we are doing this, we have the responsibility to do this, and we're going to do it, and do it in a way that this land can be used, and do it in a way that this water source can still be used for any other purpose, whether it be for farming, drinking, if that is possible at all. But at least someone has to own up, or whoever has that responsibility has to be accountable. That's being responsible, ethically correct, being trustworthy, someone reliable, or leadership, reliable leadership, which can drive the project to make sure that if there are funds for this and they are the qualified people to do the job, that the project can be driven to completion and successfully. And something that can always drive accountability, which encourage or promote accountability, is participation, whether you call it public participation or participation simply. Very important. And especially, I usually say, in the context of South Africa, where in the mining sector, it's not just the Department of Mineral Resources. You're talking of Department of Environmental Affairs, Water and Sanitation, some tourism, finance, all those things come together. So when I talk of participation, it could be participation between government departments to make sure that they are driving the same agenda, they're pursuing the same goal, whereby the Department of Mineral Resources has its role to play to make sure that mining is closed successfully and the land is rehabilitated, and the Department of Environmental Affairs and Water are there to ensure that land or environment as a whole is rehabilitated and probably rehabilitated. So it's about participation, means allow, and besides participation between government department, of course, society, concerned or affected parties, which could be just members of society like you and me, or local communities directly affected by that particular mine waste. So it's the issue is about bringing people around the table so that they can be informed, they can be consulted, they can be involved in the project. And when I say involved, I hold this very dear to my head, because I don't think it makes sense to want to rehabilitate land in a community or a water course in a community, and then the community is left out. They're not consulted on what to be done. Maybe what they want to do on that land is farming, and maybe government decides to make it a solar farm, or maybe the land is not good for farming, and that's why participation is important, to be able to explain to them that this land cannot work for farming, or you cannot stay here. When you think of a uranium mine site with constant reactivity, I don't think people can reside there immediately upon, well, it depends on how the area is treated or remediated. But then, like I said, everyone has to be involved so that they're able to understand why should it go this way, or put their own points on the table. And it's participation is also about collaborating, and maybe this works most between government department, but also can work with communities, collaborate with them. What do they want to see happen on that land? Or are they comfortable with what government or mining companies offering them? And participation is also about empowering and building capacity with regards to communities. If when they come around the table, they are being given an opportunity, being empowered to participate in decisions concerning them. And one thing that, talking of participation, there will never be good and fair participation if there is no transparency. I know we covered this aspect last week, but I think that was about resources as a whole. But let me focus on mine waste. How do people know that, or how, let's say, how do people participate fairly in a decision-making process regarding the treatment of mine waste or regarding the remediation of a water course or land? There has to be transparency. And when I say transparency, it doesn't just mean bringing them around the table and saying, this is what we are doing and what is your take or what do you think? They have to participate meaningfully. And when I say meaningfully, it means they have to be able to understand what it's all about. Say, for example, if for a mine site that is being rehabilitated, they have to know exactly what is being rehabilitated and what will happen at the end of this, and what will happen to the points they put on the table. That's without transparency, there cannot be true participation, because for one to come around the table, the person has to understand clearly what this is all about. And last week, someone asked a question regarding, I think the question was about how to make sure that transparency truly helps, or that communities, I'm not sure if, yes, it was about how to make sure that people truly participate or that transparency truly helps. Well, my take is that, and this is something I argued strongly in my thesis, is that people have to be given some capacity to be informed, to be educated, if I can put it that way. If you were to discuss mine rehabilitation with a community where there is no one who understands anything about mining engineering or environmental science and stuff, how would they participate if they don't even understand what's supposed to be done or how it's supposed to be done? Someone has to explain it to them or teach them that this is what has to happen. It's not just enough maybe to say, oh, when we rehabilitate this water, the pH will rise from 4 maybe to 6 or to 5. What is pH? They have to understand what pH means, and if pH is 4, what does it mean to my head? What does it mean to my cattle or whatever? So those are type of things, I think, for there to be transparency which encourage participation, people need to be empowered enough to understand what is going on. It's not enough to just tell people, no, this is what we're going to do, and maybe this is what will happen. Sometimes even what will happen, they still don't understand the implications. And it's really important that they participate meaningfully. And for them to participate meaningfully, there's supposed to be enough transparency. Of course, transparency goes with access to information, which is definitely a big issue with very often with people not being informed enough of processes that are going on for them to make meaningful participation. And so, yeah, and when you have true participation with sufficient transparency or access to information, definitely the probability is very high that decision makers will be accountable. And of course, at least they're not just making decisions off their head, they're making after consulting other stakeholders. And that, I think, it makes them even much more stronger. Okay, no, that's fine. I'm just going to talk of the challenges of good governance, things that can challenge good governance, because it's good to talk about all these features of good governance and how good it can help, but it's very often also challenging even for decision makers or for concerned and affected parties, or affected and concerned parties, to actually see good governance happen. And the first thing is capacity. And when I talk of capacity, I'm talking of the institution, be it a state or the mining company, having the qualified staff, the right people to do the right job, which that's usually an issue. We can have very good written legislation and make good governance the motto of the government or of an institution, but if people carrying out those tasks don't understand what they should be doing. They can't adhere they can even, or the institution doesn't even have enough staff to carry on the job. This good governance is not going to happen because there's no qualified or there's not enough people to carry on the task. Then there's the other aspect of competency. An institution can have maybe more than enough staff that is required, but if those people are not competent, when I talk of competency, it could be their qualifications or even their moral ethics. When we talk of corruption, for example, I don't think that person is competent enough. But anyway, think of things like corruption or people not even understanding their job, what they're supposed to be doing, can affect good governance. And then the last thing, but which is the most important, legal framework and policies. There's always a need for those legal framework to guide decision makers on how to make good decisions. Well, there are some very wise people whom, without legislation, they will go out there and do very interesting things. But very often we need these good legislations and strong policies to guide decision makers, maybe especially those incompetent ones. If at all, they're even able to understand the legislation itself, because that's what happens very often with people who don't even understand what the legislation requires them to. But at least having a good legislation is a starting point to say, okay, at least these are guidelines for decision makers to follow. And I know in South Africa, we have, Richard mentioned the the West Act earlier, and the MTLDA and other legislation. And I think Dalit will be talking about finances, maybe probably legislation on finances on mine waste or rehabilitation of mine site. Those things, we have some of them, and whether these legislations are effective enough or are good enough to really drive the good governance agenda is a topic for another day. And that's something that we on the project we're working on, we're hoping to get to that point where we're able to establish why is it that we still have a lot of waste around, even despite the legislation that we have in South Africa. You look from your constitution all the way down to the National Environmental Management Act and the MPRDA, they will all give you the public participation I've mentioned here, accountability. It's well spread in there. And maybe it's not working because the people applying them are incompetent or the legislation is not clear enough. But like I said, this will be a topic of another presentation. Maybe when we're done with our project, we could come back to this platform and share our findings and conclusive remarks. Thank you, Aisha. And
thank you so much. I'd like to now hand over to Dalit. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So thank you so much for having me today. To SAIMM and Minerals to Metals, I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this really, really interesting panel that's very close to home in terms of the work that I do. So I'm Dalit, and I'm an associate at ENS Africa, and I work in the Mining, Natural Resources and Environmental Law Department. So we do everything from air quality, waste, mine closure, mine commencement, climate change, energy law. So it's a really fascinating area to be in. I'm also doing my LM part-time through BITS at the moment in environmental law. So what I'm going to be talking about today is, and it feeds off very nicely off Bernard's presentation, and thank you to Bernard and Richard for your interesting insights. So I'm going to be talking about a specific element of mine waste and mine closure, and it's also a specific element of good governance. So I'm going to be talking about financial management, mine closure, and community empowerment post-mine closure with specific reference to economic opportunity. Okay, let me see why it's not going to the next one. There we go. Okay, so very briefly, I'd like to just give you a broad overview of the financial management of mine closure. So as we've said before, you know, there are major financial consequences for mine closure. So these, sorry, so I'm going to move this thing out of the way. Okay, so there are major financial consequences for mine closure. These include various different aspects, including environmental impacts, and this would include remediation and demolition of infrastructure. The permanent cessation of mining operations also means that there's no more revenue from mining, so that's significant for a mining company. And then there's obviously huge financial implications from an employment perspective, because we might need to have retrenchments. There might also be a complete reduction in the workforce all the way to nil at the pure closure or the final closure of a mine. And then there's obviously a social impact of mine closure. As Bernard had touched on, there's questions around sustainable end land use for communities and surrounding communities who have been impacted by mining. And yeah, there's certainly other kinds of social impacts of mine closure, you know, on the economy and then also on the community, as I've said. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about, so good governance and international best practice require that mine closure is regulated and managed from the commencement of mining operations. Now, this is very, very important. So I'm going to be looking mostly at the South African regulatory framework, but as I say, this is also based on international best practice. And so what a mining company is required to do from the very start, even before they are granted a mining right in terms of the MPRDA, is to provide financial provision. In some jurisdictions, this is also called financial assurance. And basically, you are securing the environmental and other impact liability that you would incur during your life of mine. And so financial assurance is very important, or when I say financial provision, I'm talking also about financial assurance. So governments, you know, before the Minister of Mineral Resources can actually grant a mining right, he has to be satisfied that the mining company can actually make financial provision. The other really important principle from international best practice is the principle of progressive closure. And so the idea of progressive or concurrent closure, rehabilitation and closure is that the idea is that if you start rehabilitating earlier in your life of mine, so let's say now you want to, you know, you have multiple shafts that are sunk, and now you want to close one of your shafts. The logical conclusion there is that if you start rehabilitating that closed shaft now, and don't leave it all the way until the end of your life of mine, then you're actually going to be reducing your rehabilitation liability in the long term and your financial liability in the long term. So the idea of progressive closure is a very, very important principle within the governing framework of mine management and financial management of closure. And although closure is inevitable, timing of closure is uncertain. So, you know, premature things happen in the life of mine. Either the mine is no longer economically viable, you know, God forbid disasters happen, but closure can happen. It's inevitable, but it could happen at any time. It could happen early, or it could happen as planned. And so what's also important to realize, and Richard touched on it in his presentation about abandoned mines, the regulatory framework on financial management of mine closure, the mischief that it's trying to deal with in the South African context is to prevent abandoned mines. So in the past, and the history we come from is that unfortunately mines have been abandoned, and then the state is left with the liability to rehabilitate because, yeah, there's just no one there, you know, to take on the rehabilitation. So the mischief that the regulatory framework seeks to regulate is exactly that we want mining companies to actually take responsibility of their rehabilitation liability. All right, so I'm going to give you a very broad overview of the financial provision regulations. So as you all probably know, and if not, then the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act and the MPRDA regulations previously governed financial provision. So it's always been a requirement of the legislative framework to have some kind of financial, well, okay, not always, not all in time, but I'm talking about now from the start of the MPRDA, which is early 2000s, mining companies have had to make financial provision. And my argument is that the way we advise clients is that actually the fundamental principles that I described earlier around financial provision have not really changed. Even though there's like a seeming change in the legislative framework after the One Environmental System in 2014, when it was introduced. And what it did is it moved mine environmental regulation to NEMA and the creation of the financial provision regulations. But ultimately, I think that the regulatory framework has actually remained very much the same. So the NEMA financial provision regulations in 2015, and also it's important to note that they do have slightly different application at this moment in time to new mining right holders versus existing ones. And when I say existing ones, I'm talking about ones that had mining rights before the MPRDA. So the current financial provision regulations, they regulate concurrent or progressive rehabilitation. And that you also have to have, as I say next, there has to be an accompanying plan. So you'll have an annual rehabilitation plan, and that's updated on a yearly basis. Then you have your decommissioning phase of mine closure, and then you have final closure, but then you also have post-closure. So yeah. Then in terms of the financial vehicles that are available, so mining companies have in the past used rehabilitation trust funds. They've been very, very popular. I just want to see how I'm doing for time. Ooh, I'm very late. Okay, I'm going to hurry up. So rehabilitation trust funds have been very popular. And what these try to do, you'll have trustees who sit on the trust, and mines put money aside for their rehabilitation liability in the form of, so rehabilitation trust funds consist of cash and investment policies. The other ways you can make financial provision are bank guarantees, cash deposits, insurance policies. And yeah, so certain financial products have developed on the market to actually make these insurance policies. Then in terms of your progressive rehabilitation, one of the kind of flaws with the current legislative framework is that you will be required to actually conduct concurrent rehabilitation from your operating and expenditure budget. And so this actually disincentivizes mining companies to make financial provision, unfortunately. And there's some, I'm not gonna be able to get into it now, but there are some interesting regulatory changes around the the rehabilitation trust fund, which actually also disincentivize mining companies to undertake rehabilitation because it freezes money. So yeah, I'm pretty much out of time. And all I wanted to say on sustainable finance is that, yeah, I'm not going to be able to get into much detail on this, but all I really wanted to say about sustainable finance is if we look at the definition of sustainability and all of these emerging discussions around sustainable finance, and I think that there's a good opportunity here for mine closure projects to qualify for sustainable finance and to integrate sustainable finance into mine closure, because at the end of the day, the goal of mine closure is sustainability, as Bernard said, sustainable end land use. So that's where I wanted to leave things. I am unfortunately not going to have time to talk about my the experience that I've had in economic opportunities for community empowerment, but please feel free to ask about
Delette?
Yes.
I think just take, we have 4 questions in the Q&A so far. So yeah, just take the next 3 minutes to wrap up, and then we'll go to the questions.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thanks.
Okay. So then I will quickly just go into a little bit more detail of my sustainable finance argument. So this has become a very topical thing abroad. And basically sustainable finance means financial models, services, products, markets, and ethical practices to deliver resilience and long-term value in each of the economic, environmental, and social aspects, and thereby contributing to the sustainable development goals and climate resilience. Now, I know to a lot of people, it might seem a bit contradictory to bring the concept of sustainability into mine closure, but actually to me, it makes a lot of sense to bring that in. because at the end of the day, sustainability is about, there's economic, environmental, and social aspects. And what we're trying to do at the end of the life of mine and during life of mine is to make mining sustainable. And so, and there's also interlinkages between the minerals that we mine and, whether it's going to be in the building of solar panels, but also, even if you look at historic mines, to try and, ensure that they are in good shape and that they have a sustainable end land use that doesn't exacerbate climate change. There are definitely opportunities here. And so what I'm suggesting is that the mine closure projects that are done properly could be projects eligible for certain finances in terms of sustainable finance. So then what I just wanted to close on is the economic opportunities for community empowerment that I've seen in practice. So I've seen, we're talking about mine dumps, and it's interesting to hear what the other panelists had to say about mine dumps, because when I've dealt with mine dumps in practice, they are of immense value all the time. I've hardly ever dealt with a scenario where mine dumps are not of value in the particular question, whether it's in terms of securities or, and in this particular case, there was a donation of a mine dump for surrounding communities. And the point is that mine dumps, as I say, I've seen them have value. So if you've been mining gold ore and you are essentially dumping your waste into the dump, that dump is very likely to contain residue of gold-bearing materials. And so those things are no longer seen today in the mainstream kind of discourse in mining companies as waste. That is certainly seen as valuable. So we've seen these donations of mine dumps to surrounding communities for them to go and rehabilitate with their own local procurement and to process the dumps to generate proceeds. And then there's also obviously ancillary infrastructure for mining operations like housing and clinics and those kinds of things, which are built for the purpose of mining, but during and after the life of mine, they tend to have, well, according to the original set of plans, because it's no longer mining, they don't have value, but because people have now been living in them, and to help fund or to help support the sustainable end land use, whether it be in in some countries I've seen things like mine tourism, there's certain opportunities there to actually retain those structures, which is also a benefit to the mining company because they don't have to go and spend money on the demolition of those things. So there's a lot of opportunities. I'm not going to have time to go into the other things, but I think there are lots of challenges, as Bernard pointed to, that I've seen in practice. Unfortunately, there's community fragmentation, there are opportunists, but then there's also questions like who is community, who should qualify as beneficiaries, poor municipal leadership, because obviously mining companies require a partner in government to actually try and, to undertake the project. And then there's question of role of mining companies post-closure, and the importance of building ongoing relationships with communities during the life of mine is super important, so that you can almost, you can actually get rid of or dispose of these issues before you even reach the post-closure phase. So that's what I have to say on this. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Please throw me your questions.
Thank you so much. It really is fascinating to hear from an associate in this field, because I am hoping to one day be a part of the field in this very capacity. So it really is very fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to dive straight into the questions. I think the first two questions will be directed towards Richard. So the first question, how is the contract disposal of mine tailings regarded under law? Can a mine contract away its liability and duty of care?
As the law stands, there is no way to contract away one's liability and duty of care. The holder of a mining right remains responsible for the environmental liability until such time as a closure certificate is granted in terms of the MPRDA.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question. When a municipality collects domestic waste, who is the owner? I raised the question with regard to the conversion of municipal bio-waste into natural gas. Who owns the resultant gas? Is the municipality using compressed natural gas in their own municipal vehicles? The there is, sorry, now it's all shifted and I can't seem to find my place. If the municipality uses the compressed natural gas in their own municipal vehicles, there is nominally no transfer of ownership. And hence is this use of compressed natural gas taxable as petrol and diesel are taxed?
That's a bit of a, I don't know much about compressed natural gas, but I would argue that domestic waste, once the owner has left their bin on the sidewalk, is in a way abandoned property, although it's a regulated form of abandonment. My interest in this is more around the case of waste pickers. And I know there's another academic who believes that domestic waste remains the owner's, even though he's put it on the sidewalk for a municipality to collect, and therefore waste pickers would be committing theft. But in my view, the moment that waste is left there, the person leaving it there has no intention to be owner. And any objections they have to waste pickers would not be based on protecting ownership in that domestic waste. As for turning that waste into compressed natural gas, in the law of property, if you take someone else's things and make something completely new of that, we would consider that manufacture, and the person who's made the new thing would become owner thereof, although there possibly would be questions of compensation to the original owner.
Aisha, could I quickly just come in on the one question? The first question about how is contract disposal of mine tailings regarded under law, and can a mine contractor weigh its liability and duty of care? So I agree with Richard. The only thing I just wanted to add is that obviously, and I'm not sure where the question is aimed at exactly, but obviously a mine can, in terms of its contract with another party, it can indemnify itself. So you can't contract away the liability of the statutory duty of care. That is a statutory duty of care. But if the regulator were to ever come for you in terms of the duty of care, you are able to pass on that liability via contract to buy an indemnity if there was a sale. And also just to say, in terms of regulatory kind of oversight on that, if you are a post MPRDA dump and you require a mining right, in order to transfer your mining rights in respect of that dump, you would require the consent of the minister. And so the ministers look out for, in terms of Section 11 of the MPRDA, the Minister of Mineral Resources. So you have to, there's certain things there that are also in place, statutory measures in place to hold you accountable.
Thank you. Richard, this is also for you. When someone buys a portion of land which has an orphaned mine dump on the site, if the owner removes the dump to use the site, what laws will be applicable to the new owner if the dump was removed? The dump is not registered by the DMR, and valuable metals were extracted and sold during the process.
So actually, in response to that judgment where it was found that mine dumps were movable property, the MPRDA was amended so that you actually need to get another mining right to mine a mine dump. So you cannot simply, even if it's on your land, you cannot simply go start helping yourself to start extracting minerals from that mine dump. You actually need to apply for a right to mine it.
Thanks, Richard. I think the last two questions I will ask each one of you to provide a quick answer, and then we'll close the session. Sorry that we're over time, but I just can't get enough of these lawyers. Okay, so where do you think, panelists, where do you think the law is lacking when it comes to enforcement? Why is the enforcement of law so weak, especially when it comes to rehabilitation? What is the potential solutions you see in this space? I know this is a huge question. try and contain your answers as much as possible, but I would like to hear from all three of you if you have suggestions. Yes, please.
Yeah, from my finding, the issue is really implementation and, of course, mainly compliance. The thing being that, Richard mentioned this earlier, many mining companies end up bankrupt. And so if I were the DMR and I want to enforce the rule on rehabilitation, and here is a mining company which has no money in its coffers. In fact, maybe it's even indebted. How do I enforce something on it when they don't have money at all? So usually that is one of the issues. Then another thing is, because the law provides, and I think Delin mentioned this earlier, they're supposed to set aside funds in a trust to even start to say this is what we're going to use to rehabilitate the site. The funny thing is, sometimes at the end of the mining process, the money doesn't exist and no one knows where the money went to, or if at all it was ever set aside. And then sometimes it's not enough. Consider a situation where maybe it requires 1 billion rand to rehabilitate a site, and then there's maybe only 5 million. That is so insignificant to even start rehabilitating. So my take is, the law is very clear. It may have some flaws, but as it is, the MPRDA with its regulations as they stand with the NEMA, it can actually achieve the rehabilitation of mine sites. But as I mentioned, the finance is the issue. And also, as I did mention earlier, something we notice with, especially with these bankrupt mines, is that one particular, especially big mining companies, they operate the site for quite a while, and then when it's no longer economically sustainable for them or to their liking, they then sell it to very often smaller mines, and smaller means probably have small capital as well, and they move on. And now here's the smaller mine which mines I don't know for how many years, and then they have to close. And the impact they themselves have caused, added to the one caused by the previous mining company, it's too huge for them to deal with. And those are the type of things we are dealing with. And if I can just answer the second question, Aisha, to which links to this one, to say, from my thinking.
Keep it short, sorry. I'm like nervous about time.
For me, and the suggestion I make is that government should be more in control of this money set aside. And what I suggest is that the trust where the money is set aside should be under the control of the government. It could be with the Department of Mineral Resources, which other department having access to information regarding those accounts, whereby once money is in, that mining company cannot touch it then. The government has to probably approve for any cent to come, so that they're constantly aware that there is money set aside. Another way could be to suggest that mining companies set a particular portion of their benefit on a yearly basis. You say maybe every year you put 1 million, or you estimate that, okay, the damage caused this year could cost 1 million or 5 million to repair. You put 1 million or 5 million in that account. So those are my suggestions.
Thank you.
Would you mind, Aisha, if I quickly respond to Bernard's suggestions?
Go for it.
Thanks. So I definitely agree with a lot of what Bernard was saying. And I think that, you know, what I've seen in practice, and I think is very interesting, and unfortunately I never had a lot of time actually to talk about the rehabilitation trust funds, but I think a lot of the time, the mine regulatory framework, specifically on financial management, on closure, is aimed at the worst case scenario, which, as we've said, is like an illiquid company that's not able to conduct rehabilitation. But I've seen in practice, and now I'm not just talking about one time, I'm talking about now at least like multiple times, where big mining houses who can never really leave the face of the earth because they have a subsidiary, they have a holding company in, you know, UK. They can't leave the face of the earth. Now I'm talking about the big ones, right? Where they actually want to undertake concurrent rehabilitation. And contrary to what Bernard's saying, or not contrary, but you know, what I've seen is actually that the money is so frozen. What the financial provision rehabilitation regulations are trying to do is that it's trying to create extra bars. So you need to now ask for withdrawal permission from the minister, and it's actually disincentivizing mine companies to undertake concurrent rehabilitation, which, as I said, to me doesn't make sense, because if you undertake concurrent rehabilitation and progressive and annual rehabilitation, your ultimate liability is going to be less. And actually, we all want concurrent rehabilitation. But the problem now is that, and I agree that I don't think the government's you know, concerns are unfounded here. The government's concerns are very founded, and they're talking about a particular family who is very synonymous with state capture, who went ahead and took an environmental trust fund of a mining company and basically looted it. And that trust fund, that just shows the areas for abuse. But the problem with freezing that money in the way that Bernard is suggesting is that mine companies who are expected to undertake progressive rehabilitation have less access to that money, and it disincentivizes them to undertake the rehabilitation. So that's my concern with putting more constraints, regulatory constraints, on that rehabilitation trust fund. I actually think there already are. Firstly, the government, in the first version of the financial provision regulations, they actually got rid of trust funds for new holders. So existing holders could continue with their trust funds, but for new holders who, after the date of the implementation of the financial provision regulations, were not even going to be able to use trust funds as a result of the abuses in the past. But what we've also seen in practice is how trust funds are usually the best way and the best way to generate such magnitudes and multitudes of money. Anyway, so thanks for that interesting question from the floor.
Richard, closing remarks from the two questions that we've kind of been dealing with, one on the enforcement of the law and how it seems to be failing in the rehabilitation sector, and the other touching on how to deal with orphaned or liquid companies that can't actually do the rehabilitation on their side.
Wait, what was the question again?
Sorry. So you can just maybe just speak briefly around enforcement and
oh yeah. So I don't know, I think, as I mentioned in my lecture, there are a lot of hard choices that need to be made, and it's difficult to hold companies responsible when they can simply disappear and cease to exist. Which is why I kind of, at the end of my paper, at the end of my talk, I touch on needing to find ways to reduce our reliance on primary means of extraction and look at things like urban mining, because it just doesn't seem possible to calculate the true costs of rehabilitating mines and without deterring investment and impacting transformation. So yeah, I don't know, I don't have any like concrete answers to issues around how do we better enforce and deal with orphaned mines.
It's a huge topic to tackle in 5 seconds. But yeah, just a quick closing remark on this huge issue that we're all faced. Yeah, thank you so much for the panelists and the participants for attending today's forum. I really do appreciate the insight, and I can see that there's a lot of interest in this sector. So we will try and get the panelists back for a second installment, and maybe something that we can get a little bit deeper into. But thank you so much for joining us, and the recording will be made available, and I hope everyone has a lovely Wednesday afternoon. Thank you.